The day my parents forced me out of their home with nothing but a single suitcase, they called me worthless and said I'd never survive on my own. 10 years later, I walked into the boardroom of their struggling company as their new CEO. The shock on their faces as I took my seat at the head of the table was a moment I'd imagined for years, not out of revenge, but because I knew something they didn't, that the daughter they had discarded would become the only person who could save everything they had built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of rain drumming against my bedroom window matched the steady rhythm of my tears as I frantically shoved whatever I could fit into a single weathered suitcase. My 18th birthday had arrived just 3 days earlier. What should have been a celebration of adulthood instead became the deadline for my expulsion from the only home I'd ever known. 20 minutes, Olivia. That's all you get. My father's voice boomed from the hallway. No warmth, no hesitation, just cold finality. If you've ever been deemed a disappointment by the very people who were supposed to believe in you most, if you've ever had your dreams dismissed as fantasy while watching others receive support for their aspirations, then this story is for you. Stay with me because what happened next changed everything. My name is Olivia Reed. According to my parents, I was the family failure, the dreamer who couldn't focus, the student who chose impractical pursuits, the daughter who refused to follow the carefully plotted course they had designed for my life. My crime? Declining the business school acceptance my parents had orchestrated through their connections, and instead applying to study environmental engineering, a field they considered useless and beneath our family's status. You're throwing away everything we've built for you, my mother had said when I showed her my application materials. Her voice carried the familiar disappointment I'd grown accustomed to hearing. The Reed family has maintained its position through smart decisions, not foolish idealism. What they never bothered to understand was that my interest wasn't mere idealism. I had spent 2 summers interning at environmental consulting firms, studying how sustainable business practices could actually increase profitability while reducing environmental impact. I saw the future. They saw only deviation from tradition. The Reed family business, Meridian Properties, had built its fortune developing luxury residential communities across 3 states. My father, Richard Reed, had taken over from my grandfather and expanded aggressively, cutting corners wherever possible to maximize profits. My mother, Eleanor, handled the company's public relations with calculated precision, maintaining the family's prominent social position despite the company's increasingly questionable environmental practices. My sister Camilla embodied everything they valued. She had graduated from my father's alma mater with a business degree, joined the company immediately, and embraced their philosophy without question. At 24, she was already being groomed to eventually take over, celebrated at every family dinner while I sat in silence, my achievements in science competitions and environmental advocacy deemed worthless. On the night everything changed, I had returned home from my part-time job at the local research center to find my parents and Camilla waiting in the living room, their faces set in identical expressions of stern resolution. This environmental nonsense has gone on long enough, my father began without preamble. We've decided that if you're so determined to reject everything this family stands for, you should do so on your own terms and your own dime. My mother's voice was eerily calm as she continued. You have until Sunday to either accept the business school offer we secured for you or to leave this house. Your trust fund will remain frozen until you come to your senses. Camilla sat, silently, her eyes fixed on her perfectly manicured nails, offering neither support nor objection. We had once been close as children, but her allegiance had been secured years ago with promises of power and position. I didn't cry then. I didn't plead. Something inside me hardened in that moment, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I'll be gone by Sunday, was all I said. Now, 3 days later, I was fulfilling that promise. packing 18 years of life into one suitcase while deciding what pieces of myself I would leave behind. My scientific journals, my collection of environmental impact studies, my awards, from regional science competitions that had never earned a place on the family mantle. As I zipped the overstuffed suitcase, I caught sight of the small leather-bound notebook hidden beneath my mattress. It contained everything I had documented about Meridian Properties' environmental violations over the past 2 years. Contaminated groundwater unreported, wetland protections circumvented through legal loopholes, toxic materials used to cut, costs. I had compiled it initially to convince my father to change his practices. Now, I slipped it into my jacket pocket. Information was power, and I sensed I would need every advantage in the world I was about to enter. The hallway felt longer than usual as I dragged my suitcase toward the grand staircase. Family portraits lined the walls, carefully staged images of the perfect Reed family. I noticed how my smile grew progressively more strained in each subsequent photo. In the foyer, my parents waited with expressions of determined indifference. My father checked his watch impatiently. "You've made your choice," he said flatly. "Don't come back until you're ready to be part of this family properly." My mother's face betrayed a flicker of something, regret perhaps, before hardening once more. "This foolishness will run its course, Olivia. When it does, you'll need to apologize appropriately." I searched for Camilla, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her absence spoke volumes. "I won't be apologizing," I said quietly, meeting their gaze directly. "Someday you might understand that." As I stepped onto the porch, the evening air heavy with approaching thunder, my father's final words followed me. "You'll be back within a month. The real world will show you exactly how worthless these environmental dreams of yours really are." I didn't turn around. I didn't let them see how their words cut through me. Instead, I walked steadily down the long driveway, past the manicured gardens and ornate fountain, my single suitcase bumping along the perfectly laid cobblestones. Only when I reached the ornate iron gates that marked the boundary of the Reed estate did I allow myself a moment to look back at the imposing Georgian mansion that had never truly felt like home. Lightning flashed, illuminating its facade in stark white light. "You're wrong," I whispered into the gathering storm. "And someday I'll prove it." That night, I used the last of my saved money from my part-time research job to check into a small motel on the outskirts of town. As rain pounded against the thin windows, I spread out the contents of my leather notebook across the faded bedspread and began to form a plan. The environmental violations I had documented wouldn't just be my leverage, they would be my education. I would learn how businesses like Meridian operated, how they exploited regulatory gaps, and then I would develop solutions that made such shortcuts obsolete. The path crystallized before me with unexpected clarity. By morning, I had applied for 3 scholarships for environmental engineering programs, sent emails to 2 professors whose research I admired, and drafted a proposal for a part-time position at an environmental consulting firm to support myself. I had exactly $342, 17 to my name, enough to survive for perhaps 2 weeks if I was extremely careful. I didn't know then that those 2 weeks would stretch into months of precarious living, or that the path I had chosen would be far more challenging than I had imagined. What I did know was that the sensation spreading through me wasn't fear or resentment, it was determination. 3 days later, I received my first piece of unexpected good news. Professor Helen Chen, whose work on sustainable urban development I had followed for years, responded to my email with an offer to meet. I put on the only professional outfit I had packed and took the bus across town to the university. Professor Chen's office was cluttered with research papers, environmental samples, and complex models of urban infrastructure. She listened intently as I explained my situation, omitting the family drama and focusing on my educational goals. "Your application materials show promise," she said finally, studying me with keen eyes. But what interests me more is what you're not saying. Why environmental engineering, Olivia, particularly with your family background? I hesitated, then made a decision to be honest. My family's company, Meridian Properties, has been violating environmental regulations for years. I've documented several instances. I pulled out my notebook. I want to develop systems and approaches that make sustainable development more profitable than cutting corners. I want to change how the entire industry operates. Instead of the skepticism I expected, Professor Chen's expression transformed into one of intrigued respect. She leaned forward and took the notebook, flipping through my meticulous documentation. "This is thorough work," she said finally. "And it tells me something important about you." "What's that?" I asked. "That you're willing to stand for principles even when it costs you personally." She handed back the notebook. "There's a research assistant position open in my department. It comes with a small stipend and tuition remission. The university's environmental engineering program is highly competitive, but I'd be willing to sponsor your application if you're interested in working with my team." That conversation became the first stepping stone on my new path. Within a week, I had secured the research position, enrolled in the program with a partial scholarship, and found a tiny apartment near campus that I could just afford with my stipend. It wasn't much, a studio with peeling paint and temperamental plumbing, but it was mine, earned through my own merit rather than family connections. The following months tested every ounce of my resolve. I worked in Professor Chen's lab during the day, took classes in the evening, and spent weekends at a local coffee shop to earn extra money. Sleep became a luxury I rarely enjoyed. Meals often consisted of whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. Every moment was dedicated to either working or learning. The environmental engineering program was more demanding than I had anticipated. Many of my classmates came from technical backgrounds with years of scientific preparation, while my education had been weighted toward business fundamentals at my parents' insistence. I spent extra hours in the library catching up on concepts they grasped intuitively. 6 months into this new life, exhausted after a 19-hour day split between the lab, classes, and a coffee shop shift, I found myself sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment, surrounded by textbooks and research papers. For the first time since leaving home, doubt crept in. Maybe my parents had been right. Maybe this path was too difficult, the obstacles too numerous, the goal too distant. My phone lit up with a news alert. Meridian Properties announcing a new development project, with my father and Camilla quoted about the company's commitment to responsible luxury living. The accompanying photo showed them at a groundbreaking ceremony on a property I recognized immediately, the lakeside land. That had been the subject of a contested environmental impact study, with documented concerns about watershed contamination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something shifted inside me. Fatigue gave way to renewed purpose. This wasn't just about proving my parents wrong anymore. It was about preventing real harm to communities and ecosystems. I picked up my heaviest textbook and returned to work. That night marked a turning point. I stopped measuring my progress against others and focused entirely on building expertise that could create meaningful change. I developed a specialized focus on water purification systems and sustainable waste management, directly addressing the issues I had seen Meridian ignore repeatedly. Professor Chen noticed my intensified dedication. "You're working as though you're racing against something," she observed one evening as I stayed late in the lab. "Not against," I corrected. "Toward. Every development project that breaks ground without proper environmental considerations causes damage that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. I'm racing toward solutions that make harm avoidance the profitable choice." She studied me thoughtfully. "There's a conference in Boston next month on emerging technologies in environmental remediation. The department can't afford to send students, but I think you should be there. I'll see what I can arrange. The Boston conference became my first exposure to the broader industry. Professor Chen had called in favors to secure me a spot presenting our research on cost-effective water filtration systems for residential developments. Standing before a room of environmental scientists, engineers, and industry representatives, I presented our findings with a clarity and conviction that surprised even myself. Afterward, a distinguished older man approached me. "Impressive work." "For a first-year graduate student," he said, extending his hand. "Malcolm Wright, Evergreen Solutions." I recognized the name immediately. Evergreen Solutions was one of the most innovative environmental consulting firms in the country, known for developing technologies that made sustainable development economically advantageous. "Your approach to incentivizing developers through cost reduction rather than just regulation is exactly the kind of thinking we need," he continued. "Do you have plans after graduation?" "I'm focused on completing my research for now," I replied carefully. He handed me his card. "When you're ready, contact me. We're always looking for people who understand both the science and the business reality." I tucked the card into my notebook, not realizing how significant that brief interaction would become. When I returned to campus, I found an email waiting from a local news reporter. They were investigating complaints about groundwater contamination near one of Meridian's developments and had heard from an anonymous source that I might have relevant information. My heart raced as I read the message. The documentation in my notebook could potentially expose Meridian's practices, and my family, to public scrutiny and legal consequences. I sat with the decision for 3 days. This wasn't about revenge, but accountability mattered. Ultimately, I agreed to meet the reporter off the record, providing technical context about the specific issues without directly implicating my family's company. I guided the reporter toward public records and testing locations that would reveal the problems without my direct involvement. 2 weeks later, the story broke. Luxury development linked to elevated toxin levels in local water supply. The article didn't mention my name, but used information that followed the path I had outlined. Within days, Meridian Properties was facing an investigation by state environmental authorities. I watched from a distance as my father held a press conference denouncing the unfounded allegations and promising full cooperation with investigators. Camilla stood beside him, her expression perfect public relations composure. Neither mentioned me, but I wondered if they suspected my involvement. The investigation created a temporary setback for Meridian, but resulted only in fines and mandated remediation, a slap on the wrist that did little to change their fundamental practices. It reinforced what I had already begun to understand. Meaningful change wouldn't come from exposing problems alone, but from creating better alternatives that made environmental responsibility the economically advantageous choice. With renewed purpose, I threw myself into developing those alternatives. My graduate research evolved from academic theory to practical application. Professor Chen connected me with local builders interested in testing our water management systems in actual developments, providing real-world data that strengthened our case for both environmental and economic benefits. As my second year of graduate studies progressed, Malcolm Wright from Evergreen Solutions reached out again. "We've been following your research publications," he said during our call. "I'd like you to consider joining our innovation team after graduation. We're developing integrated sustainability systems for large-scale developments, precisely the intersection of environmental science and business application you've been working toward." The offer represented everything I had been working toward, a platform to create the kind of change I envisioned, with resources and influence I couldn't access as a graduate student. When I graduated with my master's degree in environmental engineering, I accepted the position at Evergreen without hesitation. Moving to their headquarters in Seattle meant leaving behind the support network I had built, but it also represented a clean break from the shadow of my family's company. In the 3 years since being forced from my parents' home, I had received exactly 2 communications from them. A formal letter from their attorney reiterating that my trust fund would remain frozen until I returned to the family business, and a brief, impersonal email from my mother when news of my graduate research fellowship made the university press release. I had responded to neither. My work at Evergreen accelerated beyond what I could have imagined. Within 6 months, I was leading a team developing integrated sustainability systems that reduced development costs while enhancing environmental protection. My understanding of how companies like Meridian operated, the shortcuts they took, the regulations they circumvented, gave me unique insight into creating systems that would work in the real business environment. By my second year, our team had created a proprietary water management system that reduced construction costs by 15% while eliminating groundwater contamination risks. Major developers began adopting it not for environmental reasons, but for the competitive economic advantage it provided. Each implementation felt like a small victory, change happening not through confrontation, but through innovation. Malcolm Wright became more than a boss. He became a mentor who recognized potential I was still learning to acknowledge. During my performance review at the end of my second year, he surprised me with an unexpected question. "Where do you see yourself in 5 years, Olivia?" I outlined my plans for expanding our technical solutions and market reach. He shook his head slightly. "Think bigger. You have rare insight into both the technical and business aspects of this industry. We need people with your vision at decision-making levels." Within months, I was promoted to Director of Innovation, with a seat at the executive table and responsibility for strategic direction. The frightened 18-year-old with a single suitcase had transformed into a respected industry voice with growing influence. 4 years into my tenure at Evergreen, we received news that sent unexpected ripples through my carefully constructed new life. Meridian Properties was seeking proposals for environmental consulting on their newest development, a massive project that had faced significant regulatory challenges and community opposition. "This is unusual for them," Malcolm noted, sliding the request across the conference table. "Meridian isn't known for prioritizing environmental considerations." The others at the table didn't know my connection to Meridian. I had never hidden my background. But I didn't volunteer the information either, preferring to be judged on my work rather than my family name. "They're likely responding to increased regulatory pressure," I replied carefully. "The question is whether they're genuinely interested in sustainable approaches or just seeking better optics." Malcolm studied me thoughtfully. "Either way, it's a significant opportunity to implement our systems at scale. Would you be comfortable leading our proposal team on this?" The question carried layers of meaning. He knew my history. I had eventually shared it with him during a conversation about my unusual career path. This was both a professional opportunity and a personal crossroads. "Yes," I said finally. "I think I'm exactly the right person for this project." The proposal process would be my first direct engagement with Meridian and my family in nearly 7 years. As I assembled our team and began developing our approach, I realized that this wasn't about personal vindication. It was about bringing solutions to problems I had recognized long ago, when I was still just a daughter trying to convince her father there was a better way to build his legacy. What I didn't know then was that Meridian's request for environmental consulting wasn't motivated by regulatory pressure or public relations. The company was in serious financial trouble, facing bankruptcy after a series of costly missteps and increasing inability to secure permits for their developments. This proposal process was part of a larger, desperate attempt to salvage their reputation and operations. I also didn't know that this project would ultimately lead me back into their boardroom, not as the prodigal daughter seeking reconciliation, but as the solution to a problem they never anticipated. The journey that began with a single suitcase was about to come full circle in ways none of us could have imagined. The Evergreen Solutions conference room buzzed with energy as our team finalized our proposal for Meridian Properties. 6 weeks of intensive work had produced what I considered our most innovative approach yet, a comprehensive sustainability system that would not only address the environmental challenges of Meridian's troubled lakeside development, but potentially transform their entire business model. This goes beyond standard consulting, noted Amara Chen, our lead environmental architect, as she reviewed the presentation slides. We're essentially proposing to redesign their entire approach to development. I nodded, making a final adjustment to the projected cost analysis. That's precisely the point. Their conventional methods have led them to this impasse. Incremental changes won't resolve the fundamental issues. What I didn't share with my team was how intimately I understood those fundamental issues. Every aspect of our proposal addressed specific practices I had documented in my leather notebook years ago, the same practices that had contributed to Meridian's current predicament. Malcolm entered the conference room, reviewing the executive summary I had prepared. Bold approach, Olivia. You're not just offering to help them meet regulations. You're proposing to revolutionize their entire development philosophy. He studied me carefully. Are you certain they're ready for this level of transformation? They don't have a choice, I replied. Their traditional methods have become financially untenable. The regulatory landscape has changed, community opposition has intensified, and their reputation has suffered. This isn't just about environmental compliance anymore. It's about business survival. What remained unspoken between us was whether my history with Meridian was influencing my strategic decisions. Malcolm had given me full autonomy with this project despite knowing my connection, a demonstration of trust I didn't take lightly. Your presentation to their executive team is scheduled for next Thursday, he said finally. I'll be joining you. This could be our largest contract to date if successful. I maintained professional composure, but internally, I processed the reality that in just over a week, I would be facing my parents and sister across a conference table for the first time in 7 years. Not as their discarded daughter, but as the director of innovation at the company that might save their business. The week before the presentation, I immersed myself in research about Meridian's current situation. What I discovered exceeded even my pessimistic expectations. The company had overextended itself on 3 major developments, all of which were stalled due to regulatory challenges related to environmental impact. Their stock had plummeted 67% over 18 months. Industry publications speculated about potential bankruptcy or acquisition. Most concerning was a class action lawsuit from homeowners in their Riverside Estates development, the same property I had identified years ago as having groundwater contamination issues. The lawsuit alleged that Meridian had knowingly built on contaminated soil while misrepresenting environmental safety to buyers. I cross-referenced the publicly available information with my old notes and found disturbing alignment. The problems emerging now had been documented in my notebook years ago, when they could have been addressed before causing harm. The vindication I might have once craved now felt hollow against the reality of families living with toxic exposure. The evening before our presentation, I stayed late at Evergreen's offices, refining our approach based on this deeper understanding of Meridian's situation. Our proposal wasn't just about implementing sustainability systems anymore. It was about salvaging a company on the brink of collapse and transforming it into something better than it had ever been. As I worked, my phone chimed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Olivia, it's Camilla. I've just seen your name on tomorrow's presenter list from Evergreen Solutions. We need to talk before the meeting. Please call me. 7 years of silence, and now she wanted to talk the night before a multi-million-dollar business presentation. I set the phone aside without responding and returned to my work. 20 minutes later, it chimed again. I understand your hesitation, but this isn't about family drama. There are things about Meridian's current situation you should know before tomorrow, for both our sakes. I stared at the message, weighing professional pragmatism against personal boundaries. Finally, I responded, I'll give you 10 minutes. Call me in 30. When my phone rang precisely 30 minutes later, I answered with professional detachment. This is Olivia. It's strange hearing your voice after so long, Camilla said, momentary emotion breaking through her typically polished tone. You sound different, more confident. I have a presentation to finalize, Camilla. What information did you want to share? She paused, then shifted to a more businesslike manner. Dad doesn't know you're the one presenting tomorrow. The proposal was only listed under Evergreen Solutions, and your name appeared on the final attendee list just this afternoon. He's going to be unprepared for this. That's not my concern, I replied evenly. I'm representing my company in a professional capacity. His personal reaction is irrelevant to the business discussion. It's not that simple, Camilla continued, urgency edging into her voice. Meridian is in worse shape than the public knows. This contract isn't just another project. It's potentially our last chance to avoid bankruptcy. Dad has leveraged everything, including his personal assets, if this fails. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood the implications. My parents could lose not just the company, but everything else, including their home. Why are you telling me this? I asked. The line went quiet for a moment. Because despite everything, I don't think you want to see them destroyed. And because I remember how much you used to care about making Meridian better, not watching it fail. Her words struck closer than I expected. She was right. My goal had never been to witness Meridian's destruction, but to transform how development companies like it operated. The proposal Evergreen is presenting tomorrow isn't designed to punish Meridian, I said finally. It's designed to save it by fundamentally changing its approach. Whether that's acceptable to Dad is something I can't control. He's different now, Camilla said softly. These failures have changed him, made him more willing to consider options he would have dismissed before. We'll see tomorrow, I replied, unwilling to adjust my expectations based on her assessment. I appreciate the information, but my approach will be based on environmental and business realities, not personal history. After we hung up, I sat motionless, processing this unexpected communication. Camilla had reached out not to defend our parents or pressure me, but to prepare me, and perhaps to establish herself as distinct from them in some small way. It was more complexity than I had anticipated navigating before tomorrow's presentation. The morning arrived with crisp autumn sunlight streaming through my apartment windows. I dressed carefully in a tailored charcoal suit, professional, authoritative, but intentionally distinct from the flashier styles favored by Meridian's executive team. I wore a single piece of jewelry, a small pendant containing a preserved leaf, a gift from Professor Chen when I completed my graduate research. Malcolm met me in the Evergreen lobby, accompanied by our chief financial officer and 2 technical specialists. Ready for this? He asked, studying my expression. Absolutely, I replied with genuine confidence. Whatever personal undercurrents might exist, I knew our proposal represented Meridian's best path forward, and a significant advancement for the environmental standards I had been working toward for years. Meridian's headquarters had changed since I last saw it. The once imposing glass tower now looked somewhat dated among newer, more sustainable buildings that had risen around it. The company logo in the lobby, once illuminated with dramatic lighting, appeared subdued, as though reflecting the company's diminished status. As we were escorted to the main conference room, I noticed fewer employees than I remembered, and the pervading atmosphere of bustling activity had been replaced with a tense quietude. The company was clearly contracting, shedding both personnel and confidence. The executive conference room remained largely as I remembered, dominated by a massive table of sustainably harvested wood that had featured in countless company publicity, materials as evidence of their supposed environmental commitment. The irony had not been lost on me even as a teenager. We were the first to arrive, As we set up our presentation materials, I positioned myself where I would be visible immediately upon entering the room. There would be no avoiding the initial recognition. Better to address it directly than allow it to become a distraction. At precisely 10 a.m., the door opened. My father entered first, followed by Camilla and 3 executives I didn't recognize. He was mid-sentence in conversation with one of them when his eyes locked with mine. The shock that registered on his face would have been comical in any other context. His step faltered. Color drained from his features, and for perhaps the first time in his professional life, Richard Reed was rendered momentarily speechless. Camilla, despite having had advance warning, managed only marginally better. Her composed expression flickered as she assessed my professional appearance and confident posture. I stepped forward, extending my hand with calm professionalism. "Mr. Reed, I'm Olivia Reed, Director of Innovation at Evergreen Solutions. These are my colleagues." The surreal formality of introducing myself to my own father hung in the air between us. After a moment's hesitation, he took my hand, his grip mechanical. "Ms. Reed," he managed, his voice unusually strained. "This is unexpected. I represent Evergreen's interests in this proposal," I continued smoothly. "Our team has developed an approach we believe addresses Meridian's specific challenges while creating significant new opportunities." The other executives were watching this exchange with confused interest, clearly sensing undercurrents they didn't understand. Malcolm stepped forward, seamlessly transitioning to introductions of our other team members and breaking the tension. As everyone took their seats, my father continued staring at me with an unreadable expression, somewhere between shock, confusion, and what might have been a reluctant admiration. Camilla had recovered her professional demeanor, but watched me with newfound attentiveness. "Shall we begin?" I asked, moving to the head of the table where presenters typically stood. Without waiting for response, I launched into our presentation. "Meridian Properties stands at a critical juncture," I began, activating the first slide displaying their declining financial metrics. "The development approach that built this company is no longer viable, economically, environmentally, or socially. Today, we're proposing not incremental adjustments, but a fundamental transformation of your business model." For the next 45 minutes, I led them through our comprehensive analysis of Meridian's challenges and our proposed solutions. I detailed the integrated sustainability systems that would address their regulatory obstacles, the innovative financing structures that would make implementation feasible despite their cash flow issues, and the rebranding strategy that would transform their market position from luxury developer to sustainability pioneer. Throughout the presentation, I maintained unwavering professional focus, addressing technical questions with authority and financial concerns with detailed analyses. Not once did I acknowledge the personal connection or history, creating a strange, parallel reality where I was simply an industry expert presenting to potential clients. When I reached the section addressing the Riverside Estates litigation, I noticed my father's posture stiffen. Our proposal includes a remediation approach for the Riverside properties that would not only address the immediate contamination issues, but potentially transform the development into a model of environmental restoration, I explained, displaying before and after renderings. This could significantly mitigate legal exposure while creating a powerful narrative of corporate responsibility and innovation. A silver-haired executive I didn't recognize interrupted. "These all sound like admirable environmental goals, but Meridian's priority must be financial survival. How does this ambitious transformation align with that immediate need?" It was the opening I had anticipated. I switched to a slide showing comparative financial projections. Implementing our comprehensive approach would require approximately 40% less capital than addressing each regulatory and legal challenge individually under your current model. More importantly, it would unlock access to green development funds and tax incentives currently unavailable to Meridian, creating an estimated $14 million in additional financial resources within the first year. I continued systematically, dismantling the false dichotomy between environmental responsibility and financial success. The same argument my father had used to dismiss my concerns years ago. Now, armed with data, case studies, and industry expertise, I presented an irrefutable case that the most profitable path forward was also the most sustainable one. As I concluded the formal presentation and opened the floor for discussion, my father finally spoke directly. These proposals represent a dramatic departure from Meridian's established development philosophy. His voice carried a carefully neutral tone. What evidence supports the market viability of such a transformed approach? The question was professionally framed but carried personal subtext only I would recognize, an echo of his dismissal of my impractical idealism years ago. I met his gaze directly. The evidence is in your company's current financial position, Mr. Reed. The market has already rendered its verdict on Meridian's established philosophy. I switched to a slide showing successful case studies. These 5 developers have implemented similar transformations over the past 3 years. Their average share price has increased 43%, while Meridian's has declined 67% in the same period. The data spoke with an authority that transcended our personal history. For perhaps the first time, I watched my father confronted with irrefutable evidence that his approach had failed not just environmentally but financially, the measure he valued above all others. Camilla leaned forward. Implementation timeline is critical given our current constraints. How quickly could Evergreen begin if we move forward? We've prepared for immediate mobilization, I replied. Our team could begin assessment work at the Riverside property next week, with preliminary remediation within 30 days. The comprehensive transformation would unfold in strategic phases over 18 months, with each phase designed to generate positive financial and regulatory outcomes to support subsequent stages. The discussion continued for another hour, with increasingly technical questions about implementation specifics, financing structures, and regulatory navigation. Throughout, I maintained professional command, never once allowing personal history to color my responses. As the meeting concluded, Malcolm expertly handled the next steps, outlining the contract process and implementation preparation. The Meridian executives filed out, my father departing without making eye contact, still processing the staggering realization that his company's salvation might depend on the daughter he had dismissed as worthless. Only Camilla lingered, approaching me as we gathered our materials. That was... She struggled for the appropriate word. Illuminating. I knew you were working in environmental engineering, but this level of expertise and authority is something else entirely. I assessed her carefully, noting the genuine admiration beneath her professional veneer. People often achieve remarkable things when liberated from others' limited expectations, I replied. The board will approve this proposal, she said quietly. They don't have viable alternatives, and frankly, your approach is more comprehensive than anything else we've seen. She paused, lowering her voice further. Dad knows it too, though he'll need time to reconcile this new reality with his perception of you. My concern is Evergreen's successful implementation of the project. Not his perception, I replied evenly. If Meridian accepts our proposal, we'll deliver the results we've outlined regardless of personal histories. She nodded, understanding both what I said and what I didn't. This won't be the last conversation between us, Olivia. Some things can't be addressed in business meetings. As she departed, Malcolm approached with an expression of measured respect. That was masterful, Olivia. I've never seen you more commanding in a presentation. He studied me thoughtfully. Was it difficult, facing them after all this time? I considered the question carefully. Less difficult than I expected. 7 years ago, I was fighting for recognition in a world that didn't see my value. Today, I'm simply offering solutions they desperately need. The dynamic has fundamentally changed. They'll accept the proposal, he said with certainty. And when they do, you'll be positioned to transform not just their company, but potentially the entire regional development industry. The model you've created here could become the new standard. His assessment aligned with my own strategic vision. This wasn't merely about saving one troubled company. It was about establishing precedent for how development companies could operate profitably while prioritizing environmental responsibility. My personal history with Meridian had informed this approach, but no longer defined my purpose. As we departed Meridian's headquarters, I realized that something fundamental had shifted within me during that presentation. The last lingering need for validation or recognition from my parents had evaporated, replaced by something more valuable: the clear-eyed recognition of my own capability to create meaningful change, regardless of their ability to appreciate it. 3 days later, Malcolm called with the news I had anticipated. Meridian's board has unanimously approved our proposal. They're requesting an accelerated implementation timeline given their financial situation. He paused. There's one additional element. They've requested that you personally oversee the transformation as Evergreen's project lead. I had expected the contract approval, but not this specific request. Did they provide reasoning for that stipulation? Their official response cited your comprehensive understanding of their business model and challenges, Malcolm replied. Reading between the lines, I believe they recognize that your insight into Meridian's operations gives you unique qualification to guide this transformation effectively. What remained unsaid was the personal subtext, that my father and the board were acknowledging, however obliquely, that my understanding of their company and its flaws exceeded their own. It was a tacit admission that I had been right all along. I'll lead the implementation, I agreed, but I'll need expanded authority to make structural changes as needed. Already anticipated, Malcolm responded. This morning, the executive committee approved creating a new position for this project, and others like it we expect to develop from this model. Effective immediately, you're promoted to Executive Vice President of Transformation Initiatives, reporting directly to me. The promotion represented far more than professional advancement. It formalized Evergreen's commitment to the approach I had been developing since those early days documenting Meridian's violations in my leather notebook. What had begun as a daughter's frustrated attempt to convince her father to do better had evolved into a comprehensive business philosophy with the potential for industry-wide impact. As I prepared for the first implementation meeting at Meridian the following week, I reflected on the strange circularity of my journey. I had been forced from my parents' home for refusing to abandon my environmental principles. Now, those same principles were bringing me back, not as a subordinate or supplicant, but as the architect of their company's potential salvation. The true test would not be securing the contract or even implementing the technical solutions we had developed. It would be navigating the complex human dynamics of transforming a company still led by the very people who had once deemed my vision worthless. The professional challenge was substantial, but the personal navigation would require wisdom I was still developing. What I didn't yet realize was that this project would ultimately lead to an even more profound transformation than I had envisioned, not just of Meridian's business practices or my professional standing, but of the fundamental relationships that had shaped my life's trajectory. The path forward would challenge not only my technical expertise, but my capacity for growth beyond the resentments and limitations of the past. The following Monday, I would return to Meridian not as Olivia Reed, the rejected daughter, but as Executive Vice President Reed, the transformation specialist. What happened next would determine not just one company's future, but the possibility of healing rifts that extended far beyond business practices or environmental policies, though that healing would come in forms none of us could yet imagine. The day I returned to Meridian Properties as Executive Vice President of Transformation Initiatives marked a profound shift in power dynamics that neither my parents nor I could have envisioned when they forced me out 7 years earlier. I arrived 30 minutes before our scheduled kickoff meeting, wanting time to establish my presence and prepare the environment. Meridian's executive floor had once intimidated me as a teenager. Now, I walked its corridors with measured confidence, noting the subtle signs of financial distress that wouldn't be apparent to casual visitors: postponed maintenance, reduced staff, an atmosphere of subdued tension. The company's struggles were evident to my experienced eye, confirming what the financial statements had already told me. The executive assistant assigned to facilitate our project, a poised woman named Diane who had been with the company for over 2 decades, greeted me with professional courtesy masking obvious curiosity. "Ms. Reed, we've prepared the project command center as requested." She gestured toward what had once been the executive conference room, now transformed according to my detailed specifications into a dedicated workspace for our transformation team. "Perfect, thank you," I replied, surveying the room. The traditional conference table had been replaced with modular workstations surrounding a central collaboration area. Digital displays covered one wall, ready to track key metrics and project milestones. It was deliberately different from Meridian's typical aesthetic, more functional, more collaborative, and symbolically representative of the changes to come. "The project team members from both Meridian and Evergreen will arrive within the hour," Diane continued. "Mr. Reed asked to speak with you privately before the kickoff meeting, if you're available." The request wasn't unexpected, though I had anticipated it coming later in the process, after my authority had been more firmly established through initial implementation successes. "I can give him 15 minutes, I responded, deliberately setting a boundary. "Please let him know I'll meet him in his office at 8:30. She nodded, seemingly unsurprised by my businesslike approach. As she departed, I unpacked my materials and began preparing the digital displays with our implementation timeline and initial action items. This physical establishment of my project methodology was intentional. When the joint team arrived, they would immediately see a structured approach already in motion. At precisely 8:30, I walked to the office at the end of the executive corridor, the same office where, years earlier, my father had dismissed my environmental concerns as naive idealism. The nameplate still read, "Richard Reed, Chief Executive Officer," though industry rumors suggested his position was increasingly tenuous given the company's decline. I knocked once and entered without waiting for response, a subtle but deliberate inversion of the power dynamic from our last interactions in this space. My father was standing at the window overlooking the city, his posture less commanding than I remembered. He turned as I entered, and I noted the additional lines around his eyes, the slightly less intimidating presence. "Olivia," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Thank you for making time." "Of course," I replied, remaining standing rather than taking a seat. "We have the kickoff meeting in 45 minutes, so I can give you 15 minutes now." He nodded, accepting these terms. I wanted to address the unusual circumstances of this arrangement before we begin the formal process. "I assume you're referring to our personal history?" I said directly. "From Evergreen's perspective, that's irrelevant to the professional engagement. Our team will implement the approved transformation plan with the same expertise and diligence we would provide to any client." He studied me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between assessment and revelation. "You've changed," he observed. 7 years tends to have that effect," I replied evenly. He moved to his desk but didn't sit behind it, another subtle shift from his typical power position. "The board insisted on your personal involvement in this project after your presentation. They believe your specific understanding of Meridian gives you unique insight into our challenges." "The board made a rational decision," I said. "My familiarity with Meridian's operational practices does provide implementation advantages. However, to be clear, my role isn't advisory. Evergreen has been contracted to lead a comprehensive transformation, and as executive vice president, I have final authority on implementation decisions as outlined in our agreement. He didn't immediately respond, seemingly processing this direct assertion of authority. The Richard Reed I remembered would have immediately challenged such a statement. Instead, he nodded slowly. The agreement is clear. Meridian's current situation requires significant changes. This acknowledgement, however reluctant, represented a fundamental shift from the father who had once derided my environmental concerns as obstacles to proper business operation. Whether driven by financial necessity or genuine recognition of failed strategy, it created an opening for productive engagement. The transformation plan addresses both Meridian's immediate financial challenges and its long-term sustainability, environmental, financial, and operational, I said, softening my tone slightly. Successful implementation will require genuine commitment from executive leadership, not just contractual compliance. You'll have the support you need, he replied. Then, with visible effort, he added, Your presentation was impressive. The comprehensive approach surprised the entire board. Coming from him, this reluctant acknowledgement carried more significance than effusive praise might have from anyone else. I accepted it with a brief nod. The kickoff meeting will outline immediate priorities and team structure. I've already begun establishing the command center. He glanced at his watch. There's one other matter before we join the larger meeting. Camilla has requested to serve as Meridian's primary liaison for this project. I've approved her request, unless you have objections. This was unexpected. As Chief Operating Officer, Camilla would typically delegate such project liaison responsibilities. Her direct involvement suggested personal as well as professional interest. That's acceptable, provided she understands her role within the established decision framework, I replied carefully. The transformation methodology requires clear authority lines and rapid implementation cycles. She understands, he said, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. Camilla has always been adaptable to changing circumstances. There was subtext in his statement that I chose not to explore at that moment. The 15 minutes I had allocated were nearly complete, and establishing proper project governance took priority over navigating family dynamics. Then we should join the kickoff meeting, I concluded, moving toward the door. The project timeline doesn't allow for delays. As we walked together down the executive corridor, now equals in professional standing rather than parent and child, I sensed something had fundamentally shifted between us. The dynamic wasn't warm or reconciled, but it had evolved from dismissal to a wary professional respect. It was territory neither of us had navigated before. The command center was now filled with approximately 20 people, the core transformation team comprising specialists from both Evergreen and Meridian. Camilla was already present, engaged in conversation with Malcolm near the digital displays. She looked up as we entered, her expression revealing nothing about her earlier conversation with our father. I moved immediately to the center of the room, establishing control of the environment without announcement or preamble. Good morning. I'm Olivia Reed, Executive Vice President of Transformation Initiatives at Evergreen Solutions and lead for the Meridian Properties Transformation project. The room quieted as I continued without pause. Today marks the beginning of a comprehensive reinvention of Meridian's business model, operational practices, and market positioning. This isn't an incremental improvement initiative. It's a fundamental transformation that will determine whether Meridian survives and thrives in the changing market landscape. I gestured to the primary display where our implementation methodology appeared in detailed phases. The approach has 3 concurrent work streams: immediate stabilization to address critical financial and regulatory challenges, operational transformation, to implement sustainable practices across all development projects, and strategic repositioning to establish Meridian's new market identity. For the next 40 minutes, I outlined the specific methodology, team structure, decision frameworks, and immediate action items with precise authority. Throughout, I maintained deliberate eye contact with team members from both companies, establishing clear expectations and momentum. Each of you has been selected for specific expertise essential to this transformation, I concluded. Your role descriptions, initial assignments, and performance metrics have been distributed to your project tablets. We operate with accelerated decision cycles and expect data-driven recommendations rather than opinion-based discussions. The atmosphere in the room had transformed during my presentation, from initial wariness about the unusual circumstances to focused engagement with the clear methodology. Even my father, observing from the periphery, seemed to be assessing the approach with grudging appreciation. Questions before we move to workstream assignments? I asked, scanning the room. A senior Meridian executive I recognized as their chief financial officer raised his hand. The timeline for Riverside remediation seems extremely aggressive. Is that realistic given the contamination extent? The timeline is ambitious but achievable with proper resource allocation, I replied. We've already secured preliminary approval from regulatory authorities based on our remediation approach, which significantly accelerates the typical process. The alternative, continued litigation and regulatory penalties, presents greater financial risk than an accelerated remediation investment. My response addressed both the technical concern and the underlying financial hesitation. The CFO nodded, seemingly satisfied with the risk assessment. If there are no further immediate questions, please convene with your workstream leaders as assigned. Daily stand-ups begin tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp in this room. Workstream leaders, remain for additional briefing. As the larger group dispersed, to their assigned areas, I gathered the 6 workstream leaders, 3 from Evergreen including Malcolm and 3 from Meridian including Camilla, for more detailed direction. My father had departed without comment, apparently satisfied with the kickoff approach, or perhaps processing the strange reality of his daughter commanding the transformation of his company. Each workstream has specific deliverables due within 72 hours, I informed the leaders, displaying detailed requirements on the center screen. These initial outputs will establish our baseline for measuring progress and calibrating subsequent phases. Particular attention to the Riverside situation is essential. Remediation planning begins immediately with site assessment tomorrow morning. Malcolm nodded approvingly at the structured approach. The technical team is prepared for immediate deployment. We've already secured the specialized equipment discussed in the proposal. Excellent, I responded. Camilla, as Meridian's primary liaison, you'll need to ensure all internal barriers are removed. The transformation methodology doesn't accommodate bureaucratic delays or approval cycles. Camilla met my gaze directly. Understood. I've already been granted exceptional authority to expedite internal processes. She hesitated briefly before adding, The board recognizes the urgency of our situation and the importance of this initiative. The subtext was clear. Despite any personal history, Meridian's leadership had invested her with necessary authority to support my transformation approach. It was a professional acknowledgement that transcended our complicated family dynamic. Good. We reconvene at 5 p.m. today for first progress assessment. As the workstream leaders dispersed, Malcolm remained behind. Impressive command of the room, he observed quietly. Any concerns about the team composition or initial response? I considered his question carefully. The Meridian team members show appropriate urgency given their situation. The organizational culture remains hierarchical, which could impede the rapid cycles we need. But Camilla's liaison role may mitigate that if she's genuinely committed to the new approach. He nodded thoughtfully. And the personal dynamics? Any issues there I should be aware of? Nothing that will impact implementation, I assured him. The professional boundaries are clearly established, and all parties understand what's at stake. He studied me with the perceptive assessment that had characterized our professional relationship. Good. Remember that transforming the company doesn't necessarily require transforming the relationships. Those are separate matters. His insight was typically astute. Noted. The focus remains on successful implementation, not personal resolution. As Malcolm departed to join his technical team, I remained in the command center, reviewing the detailed implementation plans we had developed. The first 72 hours would establish critical momentum and reveal whether Meridian's team could adapt to our accelerated methodology. Particular attention would focus on the Riverside remediation, the most visible and legally consequential aspect of Meridian's troubles. I was deep in analysis when Camilla returned, carrying 2 tablets and a determined expression. "Do you have a moment? There's something about Riverside you should see before tomorrow's site assessment." Her tone suggested genuine urgency rather than manufactured importance. "Go ahead," I replied, gesturing to the workstation beside mine. She placed both tablets on the surface, activating displays of what appeared to be property schematics. "These are the official site plans for Riverside Estates as filed with regulatory authorities," she explained, indicating the first tablet. "And these," she continued, switching to the second tablet, "are the actual construction documents used during development. They were stored on a separate system." I immediately recognized the significance. The official plans showed proper environmental protection systems around the water table areas. The actual construction documents revealed those systems had been deliberately modified to reduce costs, specifically in the areas now showing contamination. "This is evidence of knowing regulatory violation," I observed, maintaining professional tone despite the implications. "Who authorized these modifications?" Camilla met my gaze directly. "Dad did, and I knew about them." Her admission was unexpected, both the direct acknowledgement of corporate malfeasance and her personal complicity. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because your remediation plan needs to address the actual conditions, not the filed plans," she replied practically. "And because continuing to hide this information will undermine the entire transformation approach you've outlined." She wasn't wrong. Effective remediation required complete understanding of the actual contamination sources and pathways. Moreover, the transformation methodology I had developed depended on data transparency and honest assessment of root causes. This significantly complicates the legal exposure, I noted, examining the detailed modifications. Not just regulatory penalties, but potentially criminal liability. Camilla nodded grimly. "I'm aware, but continuing to conceal it will only make matters worse when it inevitably emerges. The lawsuits have already triggered discovery processes that will eventually reveal these discrepancies." I studied her with new assessment. This admission represented significant personal risk. She was effectively confessing to participation in corporate malfeasance that could have serious consequences for her career and potentially her freedom. Yet her reasoning was sound from both technical and strategic perspectives. "This changes our approach to the regulatory engagement," I said finally. "We'll need to develop a voluntary disclosure strategy alongside the remediation plan. The legal implications are substantial, but can potentially be mitigated through proactive transparency and comprehensive correction." She seemed to relax slightly at my pragmatic response. "I'll provide whatever documentation you need. There are similar issues at 2 other developments, though not as severe." This revelation expanded the scope of our remediation workstream, significantly but also provided critical insight into Meridian's operational culture, the very culture I was tasked with transforming. "Does Dad know you're sharing this with me?" Something flickered across her expression, a complex emotion I couldn't fully interpret. "Not specifically, but he authorized complete transparency with the transformation team. I'm implementing that directive." Her careful wording suggested strategic ambiguity, technically following leadership direction, while perhaps exceeding its intended boundaries. It represented a significant shift from the sister who had once sat silently while I was forced from our home. "I appreciate your directness," I said finally. "This information will improve our remediation approach and potentially reduce long-term liability exposure, though the short-term implications are serious." She nodded, gathering the tablets. "I should have shown you this kind of documentation years ago, when you first raised concerns about our practices." The statement hung between us, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of past failure. "That was a different time," I replied neutrally. "We're focused on present solutions now." As she turned to leave, she paused. "You've built something remarkable, Olivia, not just at Evergreen, but in yourself. The authority you demonstrated today. It wasn't granted by position alone. You've earned it through genuine capability." The observation seemed to cost her something to articulate, an admission that transcended professional assessment to touch on our shared history. I acknowledged it with a simple nod, maintaining the professional boundaries that served both the project and my personal equilibrium. After Camilla departed, I immediately adjusted our remediation approach to incorporate the new information. The voluntary disclosure strategy would require careful development to balance regulatory cooperation with liability management. It significantly expanded the project's complexity, but also created opportunity for more fundamental transformation than originally planned. By late afternoon, the command center had developed into a functioning transformation headquarters. The workstream teams had established their operational rhythms, initial assessments were underway, and the momentum I had sought to create was building visibly. My methodical approach was taking root in an organization that had once rejected it entirely. The 5 p.m. progress review demonstrated promising engagement from both Evergreen and Meridian team members. Each workstream reported initial findings and preliminary action plans with appropriate urgency. Camilla participated actively, removing identified obstacles with immediate authority, a stark contrast to Meridian's typically layered approval processes. "The site assessment team is prepared for Riverside tomorrow morning," reported Evergreen's lead environmental engineer. "We've secured necessary testing equipment and established sampling protocols based on available data." I nodded. "Approval. I'll personally join the assessment to provide additional context." This decision was prompted by Camilla's earlier disclosure. The actual contamination sources would require experienced interpretation beyond what appeared in official documentation. As the meeting concluded, Malcolm approached with measured approval. "The methodology is taking hold faster than anticipated. Meridian's team seems genuinely committed to the transformation approach." "Necessity is creating receptivity," I observed. "They recognize the existential threat to their company." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but your leadership is the catalyst. You've established both technical authority and transformation credibility in remarkably short time." His assessment was gratifying but incomplete. The true test would come with the Riverside assessment tomorrow and subsequent disclosure strategy challenges that extended beyond technical solutions to fundamental corporate ethics and potential legal consequences. That evening, working late in the command center after others had departed, I found myself reflecting on the day's developments. My return to Meridian had unfolded differently than I had imagined during those years of building my expertise and reputation. Instead of vindication or confrontation, I found myself immersed in genuinely solving complex problems that aligned with my original vision, making development environmentally responsible and financially viable simultaneously. The quiet reflection was interrupted by unexpected footsteps. My father appeared at the entrance to the command center, seemingly surprised to find me still working. He hesitated visibly before entering the space that had been transformed from his traditional conference room into my implementation headquarters. "The team seems engaged with your methodology," he observed, maintaining a careful distance. They recognize the urgency, I replied neutrally. The approach addresses both immediate crises and systemic issues. He nodded, glancing at the transformation roadmap displayed prominently on the main screen. Your presentation to the board was compelling, but seeing the implementation beginning makes the approach more tangible. Coming from him, this represented significant acknowledgement. I accepted it with professional courtesy. The methodology is proven. The critical factor is commitment to actual transformation rather than superficial change. He absorbed this statement, perhaps recognizing the implicit challenge to Meridian's historical approach to environmental issues. After a moment, he asked, "You're personally attending the Riverside assessment tomorrow?" "Yes. The situation there requires direct evaluation for effective remediation design." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been discomfort or concern. Riverside is complicated. I'm aware, I replied evenly, deliberately not revealing Camilla's disclosure. His response would provide insight into his current perspective and commitment to genuine transformation. He seemed to struggle, internally, before continuing. The development practices there weren't aligned with the filed plans. The contamination issues stem from modified designs implemented during construction. This voluntary admission, parallel to what Camilla had already revealed, was unexpected. Whether prompted by strategic necessity, belated ethical recognition, or simply awareness that the truth would inevitably emerge, it represented significant departure from his historical stance. I know, I replied simply. The remediation design will address the actual conditions, not the filed documentation. He processed this with visible surprise. Camilla showed you the construction documents. Yes. The transformation methodology requires complete data transparency to be effective. Continuing to conceal relevant information would undermine the entire approach. He absorbed this reality silently before asking, "What's your recommended approach to the regulatory implications?" The question represented extraordinary role reversal. The father who had once dismissed my environmental concerns, now seeking my guidance on addressing the consequences of ignoring those very issues. I maintained professional objectivity despite the personal significance. Voluntary disclosure combined with comprehensive remediation offers the best path forward. It carries short-term pain, but establishes credibility for the broader transformation and potentially mitigates the most severe penalties. He nodded slowly. The board will resist. The board's resistance doesn't change the reality of the situation or the optimal strategic response, I replied. Continued concealment increases long-term risks substantially, particularly with active litigation already in discovery phase. He studied me with new assessment, perhaps seeing for the first time the professional expertise and strategic thinking that had developed during our years of separation. You've developed remarkable clarity about complex situations. Experience teaches discernment, I responded neutrally, particularly when consequences are personally experienced rather than theoretically understood. The statement carried unavoidable reference to our history, though delivered without accusation. He acknowledged it with a slight nod. The transformation you've outlined, is it truly achievable? Not just the technical remediation, but the fundamental business model shift? The question contained layers of meaning beyond its surface. Inquiry, asking not just about Meridian's potential future, but implicitly about the validity of the vision I had pursued since being forced from his home. I answered with measured conviction. Absolutely. The environmental engineering creates economic advantages that traditional development methods can't match. The approach I've developed doesn't require choosing between profitability and responsibility. It achieves both through innovative integration. Meridian can emerge from this crisis as an industry leader, rather than a cautionary example. As I articulated this response, the culmination of years of research, innovation, and practical implementation, I realized I was finally having the conversation I had attempted to initiate as a teenager, albeit under drastically different circumstances. The father who had once dismissed my environmental concerns as naive idealism was now listening with genuine attention to my expert assessment. He was silent for a moment before responding. "I should have listened to your concerns years ago. The evidence suggests you understood the direction of industry evolution better than I did." The statement, as close to an apology as Richard Reed likely ever articulated, hung between us, bridging years of separation and dismissal. I acknowledged it with professional courtesy rather than emotional response. The transformation methodology focuses on future solutions rather than past decisions. Tomorrow's assessment will establish our remediation baseline, and the disclosure strategy will follow from those findings. He accepted this redirection with a nod. "I've authorized Camilla to provide whatever resources you require for implementation. The board has been informed that transformation decisions will proceed through your established methodology rather than traditional approval channels." This represented significant organizational empowerment, essential for the accelerated implementation timeline but also symbolic recognition of my authority over Meridian's transformation. I acknowledged it with appropriate professional appreciation. As he departed, leaving me to continue my preparation for the next day's critical assessment, I reflected on how dramatically circumstances had evolved. 7 years earlier, I had been forced from my home for refusing to abandon environmental principles deemed impractical and naive. Now, those same principles formed the foundation of Meridian's potential salvation, with my expertise the catalyzing force for transformation. The journey from rejected daughter to transformation leader had unfolded through persistent commitment to creating viable alternatives rather than merely criticizing existing practices. The next phases would determine whether this professional re-engagement with my family's company would deliver the comprehensive transformation I envisioned, not just of business practices, but potentially of relationships long defined by misalignment and dismissal. The following day's Riverside assessment would establish critical direction not just for remediation design, but for the broader transformation approach. As I finalized preparation materials well into the evening, I recognized that this project represented the convergence of my personal history and professional purpose, a unique opportunity to demonstrate that the vision once deemed worthless now offered the only viable path forward. The morning arrived with unseasonable fog shrouding the Riverside Estates development as our assessment team assembled at the site entrance. Engineers and environmental specialists from Evergreen unloaded sophisticated testing equipment from specially marked vehicles, their methodical efficiency establishing immediate contrast with Meridian's typically image-conscious approach. I surveyed the upscale residential community with professional assessment. Riverside Estates represented Meridian's flagship luxury development, 48 custom homes situated on a scenic waterfront, marketed as exclusive living in harmony with nature. The irony of this positioning against the reality of groundwater contamination was not lost on me or the homeowners who had filed the class action lawsuit. Camilla arrived moments after our team, her usual polished appearance notably subdued for fieldwork. She approached with a portfolio of site documentation. "I've brought the complete construction records, including the modification orders and original geological surveys." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the materials with professional courtesy. "The assessment team will need unrestricted access to all areas, including occupied properties where permission has been secured." She nodded. 28 homeowners have granted access. The remaining properties will require court orders if access becomes necessary. "We'll begin with available properties and subsurface testing at common areas," I decided, reviewing the sampling plan developed by our lead environmental engineer. Priority focus on the northeastern quadrant where contamination indicators are most pronounced. As the team deployed according to the established protocol, I noticed Camilla watching me with an expression that suggested more than professional interest. "What is it?" I asked directly. "Just processing how completely things have changed," she admitted. "7 years ago, you were trying to convince Dad about these same environmental concerns from your bedroom desk. Now you're leading a multi-million-dollar remediation with a team of specialists." The observation carried acknowledgement of both my professional evolution and the validity of concerns once dismissed. I accepted it with measured response. Proper assessment creates foundation for effective solutions. That principle applies whether from a bedroom desk or an executive position. We proceeded into the development, where our team had already established testing stations at strategic locations. The lead hydrogeologist approached with preliminary readings from groundwater monitoring equipment. Initial indicators confirm contaminant presence significantly exceeding regulatory thresholds, he reported, displaying data on a specialized tablet. The migration pattern suggests point source origin rather than diffuse contamination. This aligned with what the construction documents had revealed. Specific protection systems had been deliberately modified during development, creating concentrated contamination pathways rather than general environmental degradation. The distinction was significant for both remediation design and legal implications. "Expand the monitoring grid toward the watershed boundary," I directed. "We need to establish contamination extent before designing containment strategies." For the next several hours, I moved between testing stations, integrating technical findings with my understanding of Meridian's modified construction practices. The comprehensive assessment was revealing a contamination situation more severe than publicly acknowledged, but also more addressable than worst-case projections suggested. By mid-afternoon, we had compiled sufficient preliminary data to conduct an initial assessment briefing. The team gathered under a tent established at the site entrance, where I had arranged integrated displays of testing results, geological surveys, and construction documentation. The assessment findings established 3 key conclusions, I began, addressing the combined Evergreen and Meridian specialists. First, groundwater contamination stems from specific construction modifications rather than general development practices, creating concentrated pathways that can be precisely targeted. For remediation, I displayed comparison images of the official environmental protection systems versus the actual implemented designs, highlighting the deliberate changes that had created the contamination pathways. Second, while contamination levels exceed regulatory thresholds significantly, the affected area is currently contained within a definable boundary that hasn't yet reached the main watershed. This creates viable opportunity for complete remediation rather than mere mitigation. The distinction was crucial. Complete remediation would restore the environmental integrity of the site, whereas mitigation would only prevent further degradation while leaving existing contamination in place. The difference had profound implications for both ecological outcomes and legal exposure. Third, implementing the comprehensive remediation approach outlined in our proposal would address not only the immediate contamination, but establish new environmental protection systems exceeding current regulatory requirements, potentially positioning Riverside as an environmental restoration showcase rather than a liability. This transformation of perspective, from regulatory problem to potential industry model, represented the core philosophy of my approach. Rather than merely correcting failures, the methodology created opportunity for leadership through innovative solutions. As I concluded the assessment summary, I noticed my father standing at the periphery of the gathering. He had arrived unannounced, observing the briefing without interruption or comment. His expression remained unreadable, but his presence itself represented significant departure from his typical delegation of environmental matters to subordinates. "Questions before we proceed to remediation design?" I asked, scanning the assembled specialists. Meridian's legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman who had observed the assessment with visible concern, raised her hand. The documentation shows deliberate deviation from approved environmental protection designs. This creates significant legal exposure beyond regulatory penalties. How does the remediation approach address this liability dimension? The question directly confronted the ethical and legal implications of Meridian's actions. I responded, with measured precision. The remediation strategy includes a voluntary disclosure component that acknowledges the construction modifications while presenting comprehensive correction measures. This approach typically reduces penalty severity while establishing credibility with regulatory authorities and affected parties. More importantly, it shifts focus from retrospective blame to prospective solution, offering tangible restoration rather than mere financial compensation. My response addressed both the technical and strategic dimensions without minimizing the seriousness of the violations. The legal counsel seemed to consider this approach with cautious assessment rather than immediate rejection, a noteworthy shift from Meridian's historically defensive legal posture. As the briefing concluded and team members dispersed to continue specific assessment tasks, my father approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. His typical commanding presence seemed tempered by the reality confronting him in the detailed contamination displays. "The situation is worse than our internal assessments indicated," he observed, studying the data visualizations with genuine attention rather than cursory review. Internal assessments were based on incomplete information and limited testing methodology, I replied neutrally. This comprehensive approach provides more accurate understanding of both problem scope and solution requirements. He nodded slowly, continuing to examine the technical displays. "And your remediation approach can genuinely restore the environmental integrity? Not just contain further damage?" "Yes. The targeted intervention design addresses both existing contamination and underlying vulnerabilities. When completed, the water quality will exceed pre-development conditions, and new protection systems will prevent future degradation regardless of rainfall or groundwater fluctuations." He absorbed this with thoughtful consideration rather than skepticism, another departure from historical patterns. The voluntary disclosure strategy. What are the realistic legal consequences we should anticipate? The question reflected pragmatic concern about business implications rather than denial of responsibility, a subtle but significant evolution. I responded with professional directness. Regulatory penalties are inevitable, but can be substantially mitigated through proactive disclosure and comprehensive remediation. The class action litigation presents greater complexity, but a transparent approach combined with genuine restoration offers pathway to reasonable settlement. I continued with strategic clarity. The alternative, continued denial and minimal compliance, virtually guarantees maximum penalties, punitive damages in litigation, and potentially criminal charges for knowing regulatory violations. The financial difference between these approaches could determine Meridian's survival. He processed this assessment silently before asking, "How quickly can remediation begin?" "Containment measures can start within 3 days to prevent further migration. Comprehensive remediation would begin within 2 weeks once the design is finalized and approved. The voluntary disclosure would ideally precede visible remediation activity to establish appropriate narrative framing." My measured response addressed both technical timeline and strategic sequencing. He nodded with unexpected resolve. "Proceed with both the remediation design and disclosure preparation. The board meets tomorrow morning. I'll need your assessment findings and approach recommendation presented directly to them." This request represented extraordinary departure from Meridian's traditional executive filtering of sensitive information. He was effectively empowering me to present unvarnished reality directly to the governing body. "I'll prepare accordingly," I agreed. "The presentation will include both technical assessment and strategic recommendations for comprehensive transformation, beyond mere remediation." As he departed, I noticed Camilla observing our interaction from a distance, her expression suggesting complex assessment of the evolving dynamic between her father and sister. She approached after he had gone, carrying additional site documentation. "He's genuinely listening to your recommendations," she observed. "I haven't seen him this receptive to external expertise in years." "The situation demands substantive response rather than perception management," I replied, accepting the additional materials she offered. "Reality has overtaken preferred narrative." She seemed to consider this assessment beyond its immediate application to Riverside. "The board presentation tomorrow will be challenging. Several members have consistently rejected acknowledgement of environmental violations despite mounting evidence. Continuing that approach is no longer viable," I said simply. "The assessment findings establish irrefutable technical reality that transcends opinion or preference. The only meaningful choice now is which response path to pursue." She nodded slowly. "Some transformation moments require confronting uncomfortable truths before new direction becomes possible." Her observation contained wisdom that extended beyond the immediate business context, though neither of us explicitly acknowledged its potential application to our family dynamics. The professional focus remained paramount as we returned to the ongoing assessment activities. By late afternoon, the team had compiled comprehensive data establishing contamination boundaries, concentration levels, and migration patterns with precision that would enable targeted remediation design. The findings confirmed my initial assessment. The situation was serious but addressable through the integrated approach outlined in our transformation proposal. As we prepared to conclude the day's on-site activities, I received an unexpected call from Malcolm. "The Riverside assessment findings are generating significant interest beyond Meridian," he informed me. "Two other development companies with similar environmental challenges have contacted us about potential transformation engagements." This represented exactly the industry ripple effect I had envisioned when developing our approach, creating methodology that could transform not just individual companies but sector-wide practices. "Forward their information to our business development team for preliminary evaluation," I directed. "Our focus remains on successful Meridian implementation before expanding to additional clients." "Agreed," Malcolm replied. "The board presentation tomorrow provides opportunity to establish precedent for how these situations can be transformed from liability to opportunity. Your approach is creating new market category rather than merely offering remediation services." His observation aligned with my strategic vision, positioning Evergreen as transformation partner rather than crisis manager, and establishing new standards for how development companies could integrate environmental responsibility with financial success. That evening, I worked late in the command center, preparing the board presentation that would potentially determine not just Riverside's future, but Meridian's broader transformation direction. The comprehensive assessment data provided foundation for both technical remediation design and strategic positioning of the voluntary disclosure approach. As I refined the presentation materials, Camilla arrived unexpectedly, carrying 2 containers of food from a local restaurant. "You've been working since dawn," she observed, placing 1 container at my workstation. "Even transformation experts require sustenance." The gesture contained surprising thoughtfulness. She had selected from the same farm-to-table establishment I had favored years earlier during high school, before our relationship had fractured, along with my connection to the family. I accepted it with measured appreciation. "Thank you. The board presentation requires proper preparation." She settled at an adjacent workstation with her own meal. "Several board members have called Dad directly after learning about tomorrow's presentation. They're concerned about potential legal and financial implications of the voluntary disclosure approach." This wasn't surprising given Meridian's historically defensive posture toward environmental compliance. "Their concern is warranted but misdirected," I replied. "The financial implications of continued concealment far exceed those of transparent remediation, particularly with active litigation already in discovery phase." She studied me with careful assessment. You've developed remarkable confidence in navigating these complex intersections of technical, legal, and financial considerations. The Olivia I remember was passionate about environmental principles but hesitant in confrontational business settings. The observation contained accurate recognition of my professional evolution. Effective transformation requires integrated expertise across disciplines, I acknowledged. Environmental engineering alone doesn't create viable business solutions without corresponding strategic, financial, and communication capabilities. You developed those capabilities deliberately, she noted, building comprehensive professional identity rather than specialized technical expertise. Necessity drives development, I replied simply. Creating viable alternatives requires understanding all dimensions that influence implementation. We continued reviewing preparation, materials as we ate, falling into unexpected rhythm of collaborative focus that transcended our complicated history. The professional engagement created context for interaction unburdened by past tensions, allowing substantive contribution without emotional complexity. As we completed the presentation framework, Camilla raised a question that bridged professional and personal domains. Tomorrow represents significant departure from Meridian's historical approach to environmental challenges. How are you preparing to navigate potential resistance from board members who have consistently supported Dad's previous policies? The question contained practical relevance while acknowledging the personal dimension of my presenting transformation. Strategy to the governance body of my family's company. I considered it with appropriate seriousness. The presentation emphasizes data-driven assessment rather than subjective judgment, I explained. Technical findings establish objective reality independent of historical positions or personal preferences. The strategic recommendations follow logically from that established reality rather than representing arbitrary new direction. She nodded thoughtfully, focusing on forward solution rather than retrospective blame. Exactly. The methodology addresses what now rather than what happened, or who's responsible. That approach creates space for new direction without requiring explicit acknowledgement of past misjudgment. This principle applied beyond the immediate business context, though we both maintained the professional framing that allowed productive engagement without confronting the more complex personal history directly. The shared focus on transformation strategy created bridge for collaboration despite unresolved family dynamics. As we concluded preparation, Camilla gathered her materials with unexpected hesitation. What you've built at Evergreen, the comprehensive transformation approach, the integration of environmental responsibility with business viability, it's remarkable. Not just technically impressive, but genuinely impactful. The acknowledgement contained recognition beyond professional courtesy. I accepted it with measured appreciation. The approach creates sustainable value rather than merely correcting problems. That's always been the objective, developing systems that make environmental responsibility the economically advantageous choice rather than regulatory burden. I remember when you first articulated that vision, she said quietly. At the dinner table years ago, Dad dismissed it as idealistic and impractical. The reference directly acknowledged our shared history, bridging between professional present and personal past. I nodded slightly, neither dismissing the observation nor dwelling on its emotional implications. Implementation viability often requires development time, I replied. Concepts deemed impractical in earlier iterations can become practical through methodical refinement and proof points. She seemed to consider this principle beyond its business application, perhaps reflecting on her own evolution from silent witness to active participant in company transformation. I'll see you tomorrow at the board presentation, she said finally. For what it's worth, I believe they'll approve your approach, despite initial resistance. The alternatives have become increasingly untenable. After she departed, I remained in the command center, finalizing presentation materials while reflecting on the unexpected developments of the day. The Riverside assessment had confirmed technical understanding of the environmental challenges, while revealing significant evolution in both my father's and sister's engagement with these issues. What had once been summarily dismissed as impractical idealism was now being considered with genuine attention as potentially the only viable path forward. The following morning, I arrived early at Meridian headquarters, establishing preparation, space in a small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., with my presentation allocated 30 minutes followed by discussion period. The time constraint required disciplined focus on essential elements: technical assessment findings, remediation approach, voluntary disclosure strategy, and broader transformation implications. At precisely 8:55, Camilla appeared at the preparation room door. "They're all assembled," she informed me. "Full board attendance plus general counsel and chief risk officer." The expanded participation indicated both the significance assigned to this presentation and potential concern about its implications. I gathered my materials with calm assurance. The comprehensive approach addresses both their concerns and underlying issues. The key is maintaining focus on forward solution rather than retrospective assignment of responsibility. She nodded agreement. Dad opened with context about the assessment findings being more definitive than previous internal evaluations. He's prepared them for substantive revelation rather than reassurance. This represented significant departure from his historical approach of minimizing environmental concerns. I acknowledged it with professional appreciation as we proceeded toward the boardroom. The Meridian boardroom embodied traditional corporate power aesthetics, imposing mahogany table, leather chairs, and subtle displays of company achievements lining the walls. 12 board members occupied their designated positions, with my father at the head as chairman and CEO. The additional executives sat at supplementary stations, their expressions reflecting appropriate seriousness given the subject matter. I moved directly to the presenter position without introduction or preamble, establishing immediate command of the environment through confident positioning and direct engagement. My father nodded slight acknowledgement as I connected my presentation materials to the room's display system. "Good morning. I'm Olivia Reed, Executive Vice President of Transformation Initiatives at Evergreen Solutions, leading the comprehensive transformation engagement for Meridian Properties. Today's presentation covers our assessment findings at Riverside Estates and the strategic approach for both immediate remediation and broader company transformation." The direct introduction established professional identity without reference to family connection, maintaining focus on technical and strategic substance rather than personal history. Several board members exchanged glances at this deliberate framing, but none interrupted the established presentation flow. I proceeded with methodical precision, presenting the technical assessment findings with clear data visualization that established irrefutable understanding of the contamination situation. The presentation systematically addressed contamination, extent, concentration levels, migration patterns, and source attribution with professional objectivity rather than accusatory framing. The assessment confirms groundwater contamination exceeding regulatory thresholds by factors ranging from 4x to 12x, depending on specific compounds and locations, I explained, displaying comparative measurements against regulatory standards. The migration pattern indicates point source origin corresponding to specific construction modifications rather than general development practices. This technically precise framing established the reality without explicitly assigning blame, creating foundation for solution-focused discussion rather than defensive posturing. Several board members visibly tensed at the direct acknowledgement of construction modifications, but the data-driven presentation approach provided little opportunity for subjective disagreement. I transitioned seamlessly to the remediation approach, outlining the comprehensive intervention that would address both immediate contamination and underlying vulnerabilities. The technical explanation provided clear pathway from problem to solution, emphasizing restoration rather than mere compliance. The integrated remediation design achieves three simultaneous objectives, I continued. First, immediate containment prevents further contamination migration while active restoration begins. Second, comprehensive soil and groundwater treatment eliminates existing contamination through accelerated biological processing rather than conventional extraction. Third, enhanced protection systems establish permanent barriers exceeding current regulatory requirements, preventing future vulnerability, regardless of environmental changes. The explanation established transformative approach rather than minimum compliance, shifting the framing from regulatory burden to proactive leadership. Several board members displayed increased engagement with this perspective, their expressions suggesting recognition of potential strategic value beyond mere problem resolution. The most critical section followed, the voluntary disclosure strategy that directly addressed the legal and reputational dimensions of the situation. I presented this with particular care, acknowledging its sensitivity while maintaining focus on strategic advantages rather than ethical imperatives. The recommended approach includes voluntarily disclosing the construction modifications and contamination findings to regulatory authorities, affected homeowners, and relevant stakeholders, I explained. This disclosure would be accompanied by comprehensive documentation of the remediation plan already being implemented, shifting focus from problem identification to solution delivery. I displayed comparative outcomes between the voluntary disclosure approach versus continued defensive posture, highlighting specific financial, legal, and reputational implications of each pathway. The analysis demonstrated clear advantage to the proactive approach without moralizing about ethical considerations. Voluntary disclosure typically reduces regulatory penalties by 35–60% when accompanied by comprehensive remediation commitment, I continued, displaying case study data from similar situations. More significantly, it transforms litigation dynamics from adversarial blame assignment to collaborative solution implementation, potentially reducing settlement costs by 40–70% while accelerating resolution timeline. The data-driven comparative analysis addressed the board's primary concerns directly, establishing business case for the approach beyond ethical considerations. Several members who had appeared resistant initially now displayed thoughtful engagement with the strategic rationale. I concluded by connecting the Riverside situation to the broader transformation methodology outlined in our original proposal, demonstrating how this specific challenge provided opportunity to establish new operational paradigm rather than merely resolving isolated problem. The Riverside remediation represents initial implementation of the comprehensive transformation approach, I explained. The methodology established here creates template for addressing similar challenges at other properties while establishing foundation for the strategic repositioning outlined in our transformation roadmap. The presentation had maintained precise focus on substantive assessment and strategic recommendation without reference to personal history or emotional dimensions. As I concluded the formal presentation, the boardroom remained silent for several moments, processing the comprehensive analysis and its implications. My father finally broke the silence with unexpected directness. The assessment findings are definitive and concerning. The recommended approach represents significant departure from our historical practices, but appears to offer most viable path forward given the circumstances. His framing acknowledged both the reality and the necessary response without defensive qualification, a remarkable evolution from his historical approach to environmental challenges. Several board members seemed to register this shift in leadership perspective with visible reassessment. The General Counsel raised her hand with measured concern. The voluntary disclosure strategy creates significant legal exposure by acknowledging construction modifications that deviated from approved environmental plans. While I understand the potential benefits regarding penalty reduction, this effectively confirms liability that might otherwise remain contested. The question addressed legitimate legal consideration while revealing the defensive mindset that had characterized Meridian's historical approach. I responded with balanced precision. Contested liability remains viable only until discovery processes in the active litigation reveal the construction documentation, which legal experts assess as inevitable given current proceedings. Voluntary disclosure transforms the narrative from concealment to responsible correction, establishing credibility that typically improves both regulatory and litigation outcomes. The response acknowledged the concern while reframing the strategic calculation beyond simple liability avoidance. The General Counsel appeared to consider this perspective with thoughtful reassessment rather than immediate rejection. An older board member with silver hair leaned forward with visible skepticism. This entire approach seems predicated on assumption that environmental idealism suddenly represents viable business strategy. Meridian built its success through practical development approaches that maximize financial returns, not theoretical environmental perfectionism. The comment directly confronted the fundamental philosophy underlying my transformation approach, echoing the dismissal I had encountered years earlier when challenging Meridian's practices as a teenager. Rather than responding defensively, I addressed it with data-driven clarity. The approach isn't predicated on environmental idealism, but on market evolution and financial reality, I replied, displaying performance metrics from developers who had implemented similar approaches. These 5 companies have achieved average 38% valuation premium through integrated sustainability practices over 3-year implementation period. Their development costs decreased 12% through material efficiency, while sales velocity increased 22% due to market differentiation. I continued with strategic precision. Moreover, Meridian's current financial challenges stem directly from regulatory obstacles and litigation costs associated with environmental compliance failures. The transformation approach addresses root causes of these financial challenges, rather than merely treating symptoms. The data-driven response shifted the conversation from ideological debate to practical business assessment. Several board members appeared to recalibrate their perspective based on the performance metrics rather than abstract principles. My father intervened with unexpected support. Ms. Reed's assessment aligns with emerging industry trends we've observed across multiple markets. The development paradigm is evolving, and Meridian's historical approach has become increasingly untenable, financially as well as environmentally. His framing reinforced the business rationale while acknowledging industry evolution, providing additional credibility to the transformation approach. The subtle reference to Ms. Reed rather than acknowledging our relationship maintained the professional framing while perhaps offering slight protection against perception of nepotism or emotional decision-making. After further technical questions and strategic clarifications, the board chair called for decision regarding the Riverside approach. The assessment findings and strategic recommendation require immediate response given the situation's severity. Does the board approve proceeding with the integrated remediation and voluntary disclosure approach as presented? The question created moment of definitive direction setting rather than continued deliberation. My father spoke first with clear position. As CEO, I recommend approval of the comprehensive approach. The assessment findings establish clear necessity for substantive response, and the strategy presented offers most viable path forward considering all dimensions of our current situation. His unequivocal support represented remarkable evolution from the executive who had once dismissed environmental considerations as obstacles to proper business operation. The board members exchanged glances, processing this shift in leadership direction. After brief additional discussion, the chairman called for formal vote. 10 members supported the recommendation, with 2 abstaining but not opposing. The decision established clear mandate for implementing the transformation approach beginning with Riverside remediation and voluntary disclosure. As the meeting concluded, board members departed with thoughtful expressions suggesting recalibration of perspective Beyond the specific Riverside situation, my father remained seated at the head of the table, reviewing notes with unusual deliberation. As others filed out, he finally looked up with direct engagement. The presentation was compelling, technically precise while strategically comprehensive. The board's concerns were addressed effectively without defensive positioning. The assessment contained professional acknowledgement without emotional complications. I accepted it with matching professionalism. The approach addresses substantive challenges with viable solutions. When properly understood, the path forward becomes more evident than continued defense of untenable positions. He seemed to consider this principle beyond its immediate application to Riverside. Implementation begins immediately? Yes, the containment measures are already being prepared based on assessment findings. The voluntary disclosure documentation will be ready for review by tomorrow morning. He nodded with unexpected resolution. I'll handle the disclosure personally with regulatory authorities and affected homeowners. As CEO, it's my responsibility to establish appropriate accountability for company actions under my leadership. This acceptance of personal responsibility represented extraordinary evolution from his historical approach of delegating environmental challenges to subordinates or legal representatives. I acknowledged it with professional appreciation while maintaining focus on implementation priorities. As I gathered my materials, he added unexpected reflection. 7 years ago, you attempted to address these same issues from a position without authority or implementation capability. The concerns were valid but lacked viable execution pathway given company culture and leadership perspective at that time. The statement approached acknowledgement of past dismissal without directly confronting the family rupture it had precipitated. I considered my response carefully, maintaining professional framing while acknowledging the underlying reality. Transformation becomes possible when necessary conditions align: technical validation, implementation capability, and leadership readiness, I replied. Creating viable alternatives requires development time and proper positioning, particularly when challenging established paradigms. He absorbed this assessment with thoughtful consideration. Your approach focuses on forward solution rather than retrospective blame. That principle offers wisdom beyond environmental remediation. The observation contained potential opening toward more personal reconciliation, though indirectly framed through professional context. I acknowledged it with measured response. Effective transformation requires clear understanding of current reality without becoming anchored to historical narratives. The focus remains on creating better outcomes rather than adjudicating past decisions. As I departed the boardroom to begin immediate implementation of the approved approach, I recognized that this principle applied beyond the Riverside remediation, or even Meridian's broader transformation. The pathway emerging through this professional engagement offered potential template for navigating the personal dimensions as well, not through emotional confrontation of past wrongs, but through creation of new patterns that demonstrated evolution beyond previous limitations. The board's decision represented significant milestone in Meridian's transformation journey, establishing clear direction toward the integrated approach I had envisioned. More subtly, it marked evolution in the relationship dynamic with my father and sister, from dismissal and separation toward professional respect and potential reconciliation through shared commitment to creating better outcomes. The transformation had truly begun, not just for Meridian's business practices, but potentially for the relationships that had once fractured around the very principles now being embraced as the pathway forward. Whether those relationships would establish healthy new patterns remained uncertain, but the foundation for possibility now existed where only rupture had previously seemed possible. The weeks following the board's approval of our transformation approach unfolded with remarkable momentum. Riverside remediation began immediately, with containment systems deployed within 48 hours and comprehensive treatment protocols initiated by the end of the first week. More significantly, my father had followed through on his commitment to personally manage the voluntary disclosure process, meeting directly with regulatory authorities, affected homeowners, and community representatives. His approach had surprised even me with its forthright acknowledgement of construction modifications and unequivocal commitment to comprehensive restoration. Rather than the defensive minimization that had characterized Meridian's historical response to environmental challenges, he established a tone of transparent accountability and forward-focused solution implementation. This fundamental shift in leadership approach created foundation for the broader transformation methodology to take root throughout the organization. The command center had evolved into the nerve center for implementation across all work streams, with daily progress reviews establishing accountability and rapid problem-solving protocols. 1 month into implementation, I conducted a comprehensive review session with all workstream leaders in the command center. Digital displays tracked key metrics across all transformation dimensions: riverside remediation progress, operational transformation at other properties, financial restructuring, initiatives and strategic repositioning milestones. The containment systems at Riverside are performing above specification, reported the environmental engineering lead, displaying real-time monitoring data. Contamination migration has been fully arrested, and initial treatment protocols show 32% reduction in concentration levels within 3 weeks, significantly exceeding projected timelines. I nodded with measured satisfaction. The accelerated results provide opportunity to begin Phase 2 remediation earlier than scheduled. Prepare implementation plans for review tomorrow. Camilla, who had continued serving as Meridian's primary liaison, provided update on the regulatory and legal dimensions. The voluntary disclosure approach has yielded substantial benefits. Regulatory penalties have been reduced by 47% based on our proactive remediation commitment, and the class action plaintiffs have agreed to preliminary settlement framework, contingent on remediation completion. These outcomes validate our strategic approach, I noted. The financial implications should be integrated into the restructuring workstream to reflect improved liability position. The implementation momentum continued through each workstream update: operational transformation progressing at other properties, financial restructuring securing necessary capital for comprehensive implementation, and strategic repositioning, beginning to establish Meridian's new market identity through carefully sequenced communications and stakeholder engagement. As the review session concluded, Malcolm approached with news that extended beyond Meridian. The transformation approach is generating significant industry attention, he informed me. 3 additional development companies have requested engagement. Discussions and the Regional Development Council has invited you to present the methodology at their quarterly leadership forum. This industry ripple effect aligned with my broader vision for transforming development practices beyond a single company. Schedule preliminary discussions with the interested companies, I directed, and confirm the leadership forum presentation. That venue offers opportunity to establish the methodology as emerging industry standard rather than isolated initiative. He nodded with strategic appreciation. The methodology is creating new market category as anticipated. We're positioned to establish leadership in integrated sustainability transformation rather than merely offering technical remediation services.